All right, we're live. So, do I say my name? Larry Kearns, Kearns. I'm an architect. For the last 32 years, I've been a principal of Wheeler Kearns Architects here in Chicago. I came from Miami, Florida to work for SOM in Chicago. I love Chicago for its focus on architecture. It is a city, a major U.S. city, where the average citizen has Chicago's architecture on their radar. Clearly, Urbs in Orto, the city in a garden, was an idea that was present at Chicago's inception, and I think could even be strengthened today. It's a livable city with livable neighborhoods. In terms of the things that I think Chicago struggles with, one of those is the many units of government that we have. Unlike other cities that reformed their political system after the 20s, New York being the best example, Chicago still has 50 units of government for the entire city. I think this tends to lend a very parochial lens where you have parts of the city perhaps in competition with one another. From a planning point of view, I think Chicago, like many U.S. cities, adopted its zoning code after World War II when there was this idea of having everything respond to market thinking, and Chicago followed suit that way. It essentially mandates a monoculture of uses where we have housing separated from manufacturing, separated from commerce. And I don't think that's relevant today. I think when you apply that sort of market thinking, you tend to look at things as commodities and that are interchangeable and that you can pay for. And it's devoid of the sort of value system. And this is something Harvard's Michael Sandel warns against, right? When you rely solely on market thinking to bring about outcomes, those outcomes in a market tend to be very individually focused and don't necessarily hold values that are commonly shared. I think Chicago for too long, like a lot of cities, has a very parochial view. You'll have neighborhoods complaining about which neighborhood gets a school, right? The reality is we're competing against other Midwest cities like Cleveland and Milwaukee. In reality, we're competing with New York and San Francisco. In reality, we're competing with London and Paris, right? So I think, again, a higher altitude view, something that is more citywide, where we look at not neighborhoods that have schools, but that the city has a variety of schools, right? Where you create networks of schools, networks that have a particular affinity or expertise in teaching particular skills or to diverse learners, right? The idea is to create the same sort of cognitive diversity we already have in the city. We want to expand that, but there are more barriers to break down, right? So if you want to have a school in Chicago, right, there's no other place you can have that zoning as of right unless you're in a residential neighborhood. And I think this is terribly short-sighted. That needs to change, right? I need to be able to have places that build human capital on our city streets, just like major retail once existed. This is going to be an industry that's growing, right? It's the second largest private industry downtown. This is going to be a pattern you see throughout, growing and growing, and the need's going to grow and grow and grow. The neighborhoods are another thing. I think they, again, were conceived of as monocultures of different uses, some of those being considered sacred ground. I think that needs to be revised dramatically. I think We have to say that manufacturing today, we are not the smokestack industries of yesteryear. There's a lot of manufacturing and making things digitally, right, that doesn't have with it all of the necessities of the past. They're almost industries that can easily coexist and beneficially coexist with housing, restaurants, and all sorts of learning and entertainment. So I would foresee that the future codes, zoning codes in the city would take this regenerative approach, allowing coexistence of lots of uses, eliminate the siloing as you would do in any major corporation or business or institution now. You do the same thing within the city. When we talk about regenerating neighborhoods, it's an invitation to think about regenerative zoning. Zoning in a way that's just not about solving problems or precluding problems, but actually looking at zoning much as you do in regenerative agriculture, right, as supporting the fertility of the environment, right? So on the agriculture side, when you grow food, at the same time you're attempting to grow the soil and improve the land that the produce grows in. In the same way, the city could look at zoning as a way to actually improve the fertility of the environment, the neighborhood. And this will require a more holistic approach where we don't grow monocultures of different types of buildings and different types of uses that are separate, but it's more of a case where you want to increase the diversity, the so-called biodiversity, right, in agriculture. You want to create places where digital manufacturing can coexist with residential, that can coexist with a restaurant, right? All these things can coexist. A lot of these things, even the human capital building part of this, right, the education, a lot of these things are restricted on our commercial streets. My sense is that the city should take a leadership role by allowing these uses which were siloed before to coexist. So one of the things that I have followed in Chicago since probably 2004, the last major revision of the zoning code, is this idea of accessory dwelling units, or ADUs. In other cities, they're called granny flats or laneway houses, right? Chicago is well situated to take advantage of this because of our alley system that exists throughout the city. Families early on would build a wooden house at the front of a lot. That house then would get moved to the rear of the lot when the family could afford to build a brick house, right? Then an adult child perhaps, or another family member, would live in the rear dwelling. Built in that arrangement is economic diversity, right? You have people just starting out, people who are well established. Modern zoning codes preclude that, right? Again, it's the monoculture of different types of not only uses, but even mandating the size of these uses. So I am excited by the recent promotion of this and the idea that people are now talking about it. It's certainly, like in other cities, a solution for the housing shortage. It's certainly a response to affordable housing. If you're a college graduate needing to establish credit and you can't buy a house in a neighborhood, I could buy an ADU, right? I could start building credit and equity. Later in life, as a senior, I might want to downsize, or I might want to augment my income and build, right? Or if I'm on a fixed income and I need to augment my income, I can build an ADU, right, to have rental income, additional rental income. So I think it fits in a lot of different situations. It's not just for one individual or another, right? So I think it increases the diversity of housing options, right? Has to be good for a city. So the idea is not to concentrate and segregate, right? You integrate, right? And you diversify. So that's what the city needs to do. The other thing that I think has promise for ADUs in the city of Chicago that's quite unique is we have neighborhoods that are depopulating, neighborhoods that have many vacant lots. If I have a neighborhood that has an abandoned school because of depopulation, I would argue that you should turn that school site into a park, right? So that you start seeding development with amenities that are low cost and universal, right? And consistent with the city's values. You start establishing parks, you follow that with ADUs, you follow that with urban agriculture. At the same time, you introduce ADUs. These buildings, because of their humble size, are not targets of international or national developers that are well capitalized, right? Those companies will continue to do larger projects, but this is going to offer an opportunity for smaller businesses to start with humble amounts of capital and start building their reputation and their capital. At the same time, that's creating other jobs, right, for tradespeople at a smaller scale, right? Something that doesn't exist in Chicago right now, creating more jobs for more people and a way to reboot some of our neighborhoods. The other thing is that there seems to be a bright line right now in the zoning code between residential uses and everything else. And that's one of the things I think we should really question and actually completely revise, so that you have housing commingling with other types of entrepreneurs. One case, in fact, that we have proposed is urban agriculture, but done at scale in greenhouses, hydroponically, or other ways of high density four-season growing. Instead of importing our produce from Salinas or South America, to actually grow our food here in the city, and actually grow food where people live, in a food district where you grow the food, you process the food, you prepare the food and eat it, right? So to the point of culinary arts, right, where you really focus on locally growing produce. Certainly you're not going to be able to grow everything that a chef would want or a homeowner would want, but you can dramatically reduce the carbon footprint. You re-envision the city as a place that can grow its own food locally, and not just commodities again. I'm talking about artisanal food, business-to-business arrangements where chefs can order different types of vegetables and produce to be grown in their own neighborhoods. New York's already doing this. It can happen in Chicago. Chicago can become a leader. But the important point is that you don't grow this type of economy separately from housing, right? You grow it together, right? So that the housing can actually coexist. And I mean abut it, right? So that you actually use the housing as thermal mass for somebody growing in a greenhouse, and who wouldn't want to open up their back door and see a greenhouse in the middle of winter, right? So I think there are new ways of conceiving how Chicago can live and grow and work together. So that's one of many examples of I think a huge benefit of commingling housing with other uses. I do think when it comes to ADUs, urban ag, or all these other ideas, remaking the zoning code, architects should have a seat at the table, obviously not the only seat at the table, and should expand their conversations with others. It comes back to this idea of having a city represent its values in its legislation, and that I would like to see Chicago on the forefront of solving the 21st century problems, is to have a city that is renowned for its ability for people to come and educate themselves throughout their lifetimes, right, to solve global problems. If you have to be a global city, you have to throw your arms open to the world, right? So I think that's something Chicago can do in the future. Throughout our 32 years as Wheeler Kearns Architects, we've always helped social entrepreneurs, right, and being co-collaborators or co-conspirators with people who want to build human capital, that want to improve the city, in some cases being a safety net or helping people to retrain, right? So that, I would say, motivation is first as a citizen, and I practice that through architecture and design. I do think that in terms of Chicago improving its own agility and the agility of its social entrepreneurs and business owners, that even the zoning code has to be able to take more risks. Instead of having our policymakers make policies for problems of the past generations, I would like our policymakers to stick their necks out, right? To be free to trial an idea, right? To pilot a program in a neighborhood. To not always fall back on, okay, we'll let New York do it, we'll let LA do it, see how it goes, and then we'll adopt it. I'd like Chicago, perhaps in that way, to take more risk, to be a leader, right? If you want to see that in your citizens, why not do that as a politician, right? And I think that what it means for the citizens is that failure has to be an option, right? Just as you're an entrepreneur and you want to iterate on something until it's perfected, right? You have to be able to do that as a city and to say, hey, we're going to try this, all right? Then we're going to ask people what they think about it, and we're going to make it better, right? But we're not going to do nothing. We're not going to just rely on existing laws and regulations, ideas that were great for past economies. We're going to actually start taking risks ourselves as a city.